Welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar today on increasing the transparency of prices paid for pharmaceuticals. This is a very timely topic, not only because of the ongoing Public Health Week, but also because of the upcoming World Health Assembly, which starts on the 22nd of May. So what's the link to the World Health Assembly? While the importance of ensuring sustainable access and equitable access to effective medicines is not debated, we've been discussing in different ways and a lot over the past few years how to actually achieve this access. And we have two things to balance at the same. On the one hand, in order to develop and produce the right medicines, innovation needs to be sustainably financed. On the other hand, to enable access, medicines need to be affordable. And so the 2019 World Health Assembly adopted the transparency resolution and recommended that countries introduce measures that increase the transparency of prices paid for pharmaceuticals against the backdrop of both affordability and accountability for public payers. However, not a lot of action has taken place to respond to this recommendation. And so today we'll try to figure out why and what we can do about that. So today's webinar is launching a new policy brief by the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies, which we started together with the Ministry of Health in Malta back in 2019. And which aims to serve as a primer for understanding why it is so complex to introduce policies or measures that increase the transparency of prices paid for pharmaceuticals, or why it would make sense or be necessary in the first place. We have a stellar panel with us today to discuss this topic, and we also look forward to hearing from you. Before I introduce our panel, I will give you a couple of housekeeping rules of how we will proceed today. For those of you who are Observatory webinar alumni, you already know how we proceed normally. But I'll just give you the round through just to be sure. We will have a keynote presentation that will introduce the policy brief briefly. And then this will be followed by 3 spotlight speakers, bringing in the national health system, the manufacturer, and the pharmacoeconomics perspective. We will then take a look at your inputs in the chat, and I thank here already my colleague Erica Richardson, who takes care of that, of keeping an eye on your inputs. And we will reflect those inputs back to our panelists and have a discussion. And then at the end, we will hear a perspective from the WHO and the Oslo Medicines Initiative to close and tease a little bit of things to come in the future. You see, we have a lot to do, and we don't have a lot of time to do it in because we only have 1 hour for these webinars. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce our panel for today, and it's an honor to have you all here. So we have first our keynote speaker, Erin Webb. Erin works with the Observatory at the Berlin Hub and is the first author of the new brief. Then we have Deputy Prime Minister Fearne of Malta, who brings us not only the perspective of the national health system and in a small country at that, but also his background as a clinician, as a surgeon. We have François Bouvy, who is the Executive Director for Economics and Social Affairs at the European Federations of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, EFPIA. Then we have Sabine Vogler, who is the head of the Pharmacoeconomics department at the Austrian Public Health Institute and the director of the WHO Collaborating Center for Pharmaceutical Pricing and Reimbursement Policies. And finally, last but not least, we have Natasha Azopardi-Muscat, who is a director of the Division of Country Health Policies and Systems at the WHO Regional Office for Europe and one of the leaders of the Oslo Medicines Initiative. So as you see, a lot of really exciting input to look forward to. And without further delays, I pass the floor to Erin to give us her keynote presentation. Erin, thank you. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Erin Webb, and I'm based at the Technical University of Berlin, one of the 2 research hubs of the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies. In the next few minutes, I will present an overview of our recently published policy brief on behalf of the co-authors who are all here today. I'd like to start with some background of why we began work on this brief, which Demi also mentioned in her opening remarks. Our focus here is on net prices, which refers to the actual prices paid for medicines by public payers. Net prices are often obscured by confidential arrangements negotiated by pharmaceutical companies and public payers. In the last decade, we've seen several novel but very expensive medicines, which has created a push towards improving price transparency for both accountability and affordability. And in 2019, the World Health Assembly resolution called on countries to take appropriate measures to publicly share information on the net prices of health products. However, net price transparency is seen to have some drawbacks, and some argue that it might increase prices and reduce access to medicines. Also, the interconnected nature of the pharmaceutical system and the use of external reference pricing, parallel trade, and more means that policy action on price transparency in one country would impact others. To further set the stage, I'd like to step back a bit and remind us all that prices are not the only thing that are not transparent in the pharmaceutical system. The figure on this slide identifies several of these elements at various phases of the pharmaceutical life cycle, including research and development costs, the process that payers use to set a price, and the terms of confidential agreements. But ultimately, our focus on this brief was net price transparency, which was defined in the World Health Assembly resolution as the amount received by manufacturers after subtraction of all rebates, discounts, and other incentives. To conduct the research, we took 3 distinct steps. First, we conducted an exploratory scoping search in the scientific and policy literature to identify empirical sources, but also other information on the effect of price transparency on prices. We then asked experts to review this gathered evidence. And for the third step, in part due to the lack of evidence that we found, we arranged group interviews with various stakeholders from along the interest spectrum to further refine and contextualize our findings. These 5 group interviews with 25 participants enhanced our understanding of the real-world applicability and the implications of related policy change. An overview of our scoping search is condensed on this slide, and while we unfortunately do not have the time to go into the details of the literature, we can summarize that there is limited empirical evidence on the effect of price transparency in pharmaceuticals. Most published literature, especially in the European context, is argumentative or theoretical in nature. We also looked outside of pharmaceuticals to other health sectors and other industries, but these also had limitations and transferability issues. Some recent publications, including a scoping review and a WHO-coordinated systematic review, also confirmed the lack of empirical evidence on net price transparency. One white paper from the US mapped the non-transparent values in determining a pharmaceutical price, which we have adapted for the European context. As we've alluded to already, payment for pharmaceuticals from public payers to pharmaceutical companies is non-transparent due to the prevalence of confidential discounts. Between pharmaceutical companies and distributors, markups and margins are regulated to varying degrees across countries. And although these incentives, discounts, or other arrangements occur in the private sector, they can also have an impact on the prices paid by the public sector, not to mention the level of out-of-pocket payments paid by the population. Clawbacks also complicate the understanding about how much is paid for individual medicines, as they return a portion of pharmaceutical expenditure to public payers if revenues or public spending reaches a certain level. This can therefore overestimate the level of spending and further muddle the information about prices paid. So what does ultimately shape prices for pharmaceuticals? It's a balance between public payers and pharmaceutical companies. Both have a shared interest in enabling timely access to medicines, but there is a tension between payers who aim to contain costs and companies who seek to maximize profits. Public payers employ a range of policies to determine what they will pay for medicine, but intrinsic factors, such as health system budgets and population size, play an important role. Some, but not all countries in Europe, use complex pricing strategies like value-based pricing, managed entry agreements, or health technology assessments. And especially in Europe, many payers use external reference pricing and look to other countries for guidance about what to pay for a medicine. As such, pharmaceutical companies are incentivized to keep these listed prices high in order to have the external reference prices as high as possible. The difference between list price and net price does not allow public payers to know whether they're getting a good deal, and it makes it difficult to hold public payers accountable for the resources they devote to pharmaceuticals. And the pharmaceutical companies consider existing market prices for equivalent alternatives or lack of alternatives in the case of novel on-patent medicines. Timing is also a factor, both in terms of how long the patent will last and in which country it makes sense to enter first. Specifically, countries that typically have both high list prices and are frequently used in pricing comparisons often have an earlier launch date. Joint factors, including the level of information available to all parties and experience with negotiation, as well as personal relationships, also play a role. And the factors listed on the slide are by no means comprehensive, but they set some context for considering net price transparency policies. And one thing that should also be noted is the prevalence of parallel trade in the European market. While net price transparency in pharmaceuticals is still elusive, several efforts have emerged around this topic. At the global level, more than 140 countries report details of their vaccine purchases to the WHO. The Market Information for Access to Vaccines initiative collects and reports on this data. This initiative is particularly used in countries covered by Gavi, a vaccine alliance to improve access to vaccines for children in low-income countries. In Gavi countries, price information was 100% complete, but for high-income countries that procure their own medicines, only 52% provided this full information about vaccine purchases. At the EU level, the EU Transparency Directive requires sharing the list prices of reimbursed medicines, but not net prices. EURIPID is primarily a database which provides national list prices of reimbursable medicines from mainly European countries that are willing to share their own data in compliance with confidentiality regulations. EURIPID has also explored including more information, for example, about managed entry agreements. Some countries report that agreements exist, but not their terms, while other countries are hesitant to even identify whether an agreement exists due to confidentiality clauses. In addition to the existing efforts, there are several proposals that I will briefly highlight. The first of these are clearinghouses, which are mechanisms that anonymously collect information from payers, which a trusted third party collates and shares. In the context of pharmaceutical prices, clearinghouses could collect data from payers on net prices after confidential discounts without disclosing the country that provided the data. Cost-plus approaches calculate the associated cost for producing a medicine and add additional revenues on top. However, cost information is one of the non-transparent values within the pharmaceutical system. Last but not least, equity pricing, sometimes also known as tiered pricing, allows for different prices across countries depending on their ability to pay, for example, income levels or purchasing power. Collaborations within Europe related to pharmaceutical procurement have occurred both at the EU level and between smaller groups of countries as depicted here. Other collaborative pharmaceutical initiatives are generally not set up with the explicit goal of sharing information about net prices and instead coordinate on technical issues. Yet in the case of joint procurement, net price information does become available. And the recent experience with COVID-19 vaccine procurement prompted an unprecedented cross-country collaboration using an advanced purchasing agreement mechanism. In this experience, both EU countries and vaccine manufacturers accepted a single price within the terms of each agreement, although many terms remain confidential. This study concludes that given the lack of natural experiments and empirical evidence, the consequences of price transparency still remain unclear. However, movement towards price transparency policies can be expected, especially given the experience with COVID-19 vaccine procurement. Any policy action must consider the differing needs and capacities across countries, as well as the complexities of interactions between stakeholders, and it will require careful design and implementation with ongoing monitoring of potential effects. Ultimately, reforms in pharmaceutical policy should be evaluated in the context of the triple aims of providing timely and affordable access to safe and effective medicines, continuing to focus on innovation by providing incentives for truly novel medicines, and safeguarding financial sustainability by pricing publicly funded medicines at an appropriate level for future health budgets. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to the co-authors, reviewers, and group interview participants for their work on the recently published policy brief. And if you're interested in the subject, the Observatory has published related works as well, which I encourage you to check out. Thank you very much, and back to Dimi.
Thank you very much, Erin, for this concise overview of what the brief offers, and for trying to explain to us the different elements that we need to bear in mind to understand why we might want to introduce transparency policies and what the implications are, and what we must think about before or when we do so. I think it's very important to highlight here this very clear message from our work, but also from other colleagues, that we don't have a lot of empirical evidence to back up the theory that price transparency would increase prices. We also don't have evidence in the opposite direction. And it's a little bit of a catch-22, because as long as we don't have evidence, it's understandable that there is reluctance to introduce such policies. And while these policies are not introduced, no empirical evidence is actually generated. So it's a bit of a catch-22, as I said. Thank you very much, Erin. We bring you back in during the discussion with the audience. And we go now to our spotlight speakers. And I think the very first reflection should come from the national health system perspective, in particular of a small country with a relatively small population, and therefore not necessarily a strong negotiating position when it comes to pricing medicines. So Deputy Prime Minister Chris Fearne, I'm coming over to you. Give us your insights on price transparency. Should we move ahead with it?
Yes, thank you. So the short answer is yes.
Okay.
But I have 5 minutes, so I'll...
Yes, please go ahead, of course.
I'll make 3 points, so I won't overstep my time limit as much as I can. So first and foremost, let's just talk about price transparency as a principle. So we live in an age where people in authority, people in positions of power are rightly expected to be accountable, right? So politicians need to be accountable, but not just politicians. People who are in positions of authority need to be accountable. And of course, to be accountable, you need to be transparent. So even on a level, on just a level of principle, to ensure good governance, you need transparency. And of course, it applies to individuals, but it also applies to systems, and it applies to processes whereby government entities can be associated or implicated. So even on a level of on a level of principle, price transparency and the process whereby prices are set. So coming all the way, as you explained in your policy brief, from development, from research and development of the drug, all the way to clinical trials, to marketing, to distribution, and to negotiation, to my mind, needs to be accountable and therefore needs to be transparent. So that is on the level of principle. But of course, we're not just concerned with what's expected today in a modern society, but we also want to be pragmatic. And to be pragmatic, I think your policy brief, if I may be so bold as to say, misses a point slightly, in that it's not just whether transparency per se on its own, in and of itself, will lead to a change in net pricing, necessarily lead to a change in net pricing, but it's price transparency as the first step of an important process, which includes joint negotiating and then joint procurement, which then in itself eventually will lead to stabilization of prices and to, I'm sure, better prices for the consumer. So price transparency is absolutely necessary, is essential as a first step for joint negotiation. We tried this, the Valletta Declaration goes back now to 2017. So it's a long time away, 5 years ago. And we've tried to go this the other way around. So we tried to come together as 11, 12 European member states to negotiate jointly with the pharmaceutical industry. We found that we could not do this unless we knew each other's prices. So price transparency is the first step towards joint negotiation and joint procurement. Does it work? Yes. We've done this now with the COVID vaccine. The COVID vaccine came onto the market in December of came to our patients, to our citizens in December of 2020, jointly procured and jointly negotiated by the 27 European member states. And I am absolutely sure that had we negotiated separately as a small country with 500,000 population, not now when there is in Europe a lot of vaccines and some countries are trying to come out of their contracts, but in December of 2020, when vaccines were looked at more desirable than gold, then I'm sure as a small country, we wouldn't have got the prices that we got now. And we wouldn't even have got the accessibility that we got in 2020. So the COVID experience, and we had to do this because we were in a crisis, showed that price transparency is essential for joint negotiation, for joint procurement, and that joint procurement eventually leads to better outcomes for the accessibility of our citizens across the whole of Europe. The third and final point is, of course, that none of us are expecting that the pharmaceutical industry or the manufacturers will not make a profit. Of course, they need to make a profit. Of course, there have to be financial incentives to take the risk of developing a new drug. Of course, there have to be financial incentives for research and development. Of course, we know that they look at many molecules and only a few succeed. But what we are saying is that we need to have a fair price, a fair deal. And for us to know, for us buyers, to know that we are getting a fair price, we need to know what the other people are paying for the same drug at the same time. So yes, price transparency is important on three points. One, as a principle. Two, because it is the essential first step for joint negotiation. And three, because we all want a fair deal and we want to know that we are getting a fair deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think very clear, and the balance between principle and pragmatism is always very welcome. I think we do discuss in the brief this clearly the importance and the potential of joint purchasing. I think also highlighting the different types of transparency, where transparency among payers is definitely one, and then even more to the transparent side is also public transparency, which for accountability purposes perhaps weighs a bit stronger. But thank you very, very much for the 3 points and for making them so clearly. The bridge is very nice because we move to our next spotlight speaker who comes from the industry. And the link to your last point on understanding clearly that there is need for profit, but there is a side, the other side to the argument, I think leads us very well into what François has to say. So Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much. We bring you back in for the discussion. And François, we come to you. I think quite an important role as always for the industry here. Give us your perspective on this issue of price transparency.
Many thanks, Dimitra. Can you hear me? Yeah, so when implementing pharmaceutical policy initiatives, we need to carefully assess different aspects of transparency and what type of measures are fit for purpose if the objective is to improve access to innovative medicines across the European region. The EFPIA believes that we need more transparency and information sharing around market access hurdles in the EU and beyond. In other words, an analysis of the various factors that impact delayed access and or lack of availability of specific products or classes of products in a specific country. The report on root causes to unavailability and market access delays that EFPIA published in 2020 was a first step in that direction. Last month, EFPIA released a set of concrete proposals to improve patient access to innovative medicines and reduce inequalities across Europe. These proposals include, but are not limited to, a commitment from the industry to file pricing and reimbursement applications in all EU 27 countries no later than 2 years after EU market authorization, the creation of a European access portal where marketing authorization holders can provide timely information regarding the timing and processing of pricing and reimbursement applications in the various EU 27 countries, including the reasons why there is a delay in the pricing and reimbursement decision process, or why the marketing authorization holder has not filed an application in a particular market, and also a conceptual framework for equity-based tier pricing to ensure that ability to pay across countries is considered in the prices of innovative medicines, which is anchored in the principle of solidarity between countries to reduce the availability of new medicines and access delays. We also believe that more information sharing around implementation of pricing and payment models, including novel payment models such as outcome-based agreements and staggered payment models, can help countries together with the industry to implement those models that best suit their specific situation. Although there are aspects of these payment models that need to be confidential for commercial reasons, we should together explore how the existence of these agreements and how they function can be disclosed to improve information sharing and best practices. EFPIA also adopted a white paper on transparency of evidence from novel payment models to launch a discussion of how evidence collected under outcomes-based agreements could be shared with other actors. Currently, outcomes data collected under some types of novel pricing and payment models and the evidence resulting from their analysis are not always publicly disclosed, leading to the perception that these arrangements are opaque and that the potentially beneficial data are not available for other purposes. At the same time, we caution against moving towards transparency of the actual net prices. Confidential net prices are currently the only way in which the industry and payers together can implement prices that are adapted to the economic and epidemiological context of a country. Many studies show that net price transparency will lead to price convergence, which will negatively affect access and affordability in countries with lower GDP per capita and thus increase inequalities in the European region. Instead, we should work together to improve the information about what therapies and vaccines are currently under development and when this could reach health systems and what impact they would have in terms of patients' outcomes, patient pathways, health economy, and the organization of care. I'm going to stop here. Obviously, it's a little bit more than 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, François, for sticking to the time and for the overview. And I really appreciate the mentions of the different positions and resources from FPI. I think we'll make sure to find them and also have them available for our participants. I'm very interested in your equity-based pricing approach and whether that would then make the need for confidential discounts disappear, but we can talk about that later in the discussion, or if we have the time. Yes. So for now, I switch off from you. Thank you very much, François, and we move to Sabine. Sabine, you've worked with in this area for a really long time. You talk to many payers. You look at different. You also study. You do a lot of research in this area. So give us your perspective. We heard from our two previous spotlight speakers the need to introduce such measures and the caution of introducing such measures. What is your experience?
Yeah, thank you, Dimi, and thank you for the introduction. And I really would like now to bring in and add the perspective from a public health research perspective. And I'd like first to follow up on the rationale and what's the rationale for transparency. I think Deputy Minister Fearne already highlighted it and explained the relevance of good governance and accountability of public authorities and payers to the public. But there's a second aspect that I would like to mention, and that's about evidence-based informed decisions. Because what is the final aim? The final aim is to ensure affordable patient access to needed, to cost-effective medicines, and only if sufficient information is there, then good decisions can be taken. This does not only concern prices. For value-based pricing, you need information on added therapeutic value. You need also information on negative outcomes of clinical studies. For more cost-based, you then need the R&D costs. So that to start with. And I'm aware that the brief is on the net price transparency, but still, I'd just like to broaden a little bit the picture and saying we should be aware and see the whole price dimension, also starting with the list prices. I mean, the situation is quite good with the list prices in several European countries. But in the larger region of the WHO, European region, Central Asian countries, for instance, there is no price regulation. And this would be the prerequisite for list price transparency. And even in some European countries, we have the list prices, but do we really have them for all medicines or just for the reimbursed ones? Or thinking about the fact that some countries have the price setting at the wholesale price level, and then the ex-factory price is negotiated, which can be an issue again with than other countries. And even procurement prices, which are known, sometimes they're not displayed in a very meaningful way. Another aspect I would like to bring in is that transparency. There's no black or white situation, but as you can see here and also mentioned in the brief, there are different dimensions and shades. So while maybe the final aim is to have full access to information for the public, from a pragmatic point of view, if I may take up this, what would be useful is on the way there to have at least partial transparency, meaning that information is there for the public payers. And how can this be done? And some examples were already being brought, but even a simple example like flagging the existence of a managed entry agreement, not disclosing the content or the discount, but at least that helps other countries to say, oh, be aware, an external price reference, and there's something to consider. Also, there are different public institutions. They are all public institutions responsible for taxpayers' money. And it happens that managed entry agreement is negotiated by one and others do not know it. And so this is something to be looked at. And the clearinghouse was already mentioned before. So what I would like to end saying is it's possible to have more transparency, higher accessibility of information by, this can be achieved sometimes without breaching confidentiality clauses. And I would really encourage authorities to consider moving forward this way, and also having monitoring and evaluation of that so that we then know what has worked and what has not worked. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I think that ties well with the points from actually both previous speakers, Deputy Prime Minister Fearne pointing out the successful collaboration among payers and the necessity for transparency between payers. And then François also pointing out let's say the perspective of EFPIA towards making sure that processes are more transparent and there is more information available. I see there is a lot of interaction in the chat, or at least a lot of inputs of different types. I will ask Erica to perhaps give us a couple of the points that have been given to the panel directly, because there are also inputs from different sides that participants might want to look at, but give us the gist, Erica, to take us to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Dimi. Yes, lots of really interesting questions coming up in the chat box, but to sort of paraphrase and summarize, really interesting question, I think, for all the people in the panel, which is, should we make external reference pricing or international reference pricing? Should we just end it? Is that one of the possible solutions we should be looking at? So all those in favor of external reference pricing, say aye now. And then someone also asked about the spread of prices. So, because it's something that François brought up in his spotlight, who actually gets a better deal if there is this spread of prices on, you know, like, could we have some idea of what that spread is, and which countries have been successful in driving a harder bargain and getting a better deal, and what did they do to achieve that? And then there's quite a lot of discussion about how we can better support research by making prices transparent, not just to the purchasers, but also the research community, and around paywalls for databases and things like that. So maybe that's one for Sabine, but those are things to get started with.
Yes, on the last point, from my understanding, increasing price transparency to support research, and the link is what? No,
increasing transparency to the actual prices. So if you've got a database of prices or horizon scanning, things like this, it's not, sometimes there is a paywall for researchers to actually get access to it.
Okay, I see. And then I'm assuming the link is, I haven't really read the questions in the chat, is also that, you know, because we mentioned we don't have empirical evidence, that also to do analysis, you need the sort of data.
Yeah.
All right. Well, okay, thank you very much. I think the participant who put, at least one that I saw flashing on my screen here, who put in the question about ending external price referencing, international pricing, makes the link that the idea would be that the reason confidential discounts are necessary is because different countries reference other countries. So perhaps the way to end this necessity for confidentiality or for lack of transparency is to move away from external reference pricing. And so I'll take the question to the panel. I think, Sabine, we'll start with you because you've done a lot of extensive work on external reference pricing. I think then, François, we come to you, followed by Chris, and then Erin and Natasha if she wants to come in. Sabine, over to you. End ERP forever?
Yeah, that's a good question, which we have been discussing for long. And I absolutely agree, there are the limitations of ERP. So it's something that we should consider for the future, how to change the system. But the question is, what is the alternative? And I'm here speaking again from an overall picture. We are doing also advice to countries which have no price regulation, which I talked about. And for instance, if these countries start with price regulation, they won't be the country starting with HDA, value-based pricing. They need to have some pricing policies which is simpler. It's not simple, please do not understand it like that, but it's simpler. So ERP, I think, has its role, as the other pricing policies have a role, but we should be aware about the limitations and then find how to have a good balance. And as I have the floor now, I just want to clarify something, that there must have been a misunderstanding about PPI price data. That's something really new to me. PPI, pharmaceutical pricing and reimbursement information, is a network of competent authorities. We do not have price data. So just to clarify that, maybe this was meant about Europe, I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
PPI.
Okay, no, thank you. That's important, and thank you also for keeping an eye on the chat yourself, Sabine. We very, very good. Our speakers are usually very, very good at that. François, over to you. External reference pricing plays a role here. What are your thoughts?
Yes, it does. But I want to react on the comments about who gets a better deal or not.
We come to that in a minute. It's second round of questions, so I'll ask you that in a second. just let's stick to EPR for now, if that's okay.
Yes, certainly external reference pricing has a role, just because depending on how you price on how the medicinal product is priced in the country, if it is priced at a quite lower level in order to meet, let's say, the context, that specific country context, it will have implication beyond that country, just because other countries will refer to that price. So it has directly an impact on the overall return and also on access. And we should not, and so this is why we need absolutely to address the issue of transparency, to what extent transparency can lead to improve access or not. And this is where I would like to react on this issue of who gets a better deal or not. What I take note is that when you have a country making a deal, you know, a payer making a deal with a manufacturer, they have a deal. But we are more concerned about those countries where there is no deal between the payers and the manufacturers, just because it means no access to innovative medicines for the patients of those countries. So this is where the concern and the EFPIA's approach when releasing these access proposals that I have referred to wants basically the discussion to move. It's basically why we are discussing transparency of net prices. It's the objective, it's improve access and reduce inequalities in terms of access within the European region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, François. We come back to the deal issue in a second, or rather how this whole fair deal ties also with equity-based pricing. So we come back to that in a minute. I think we had Deputy Prime Minister Fearne next. External reference pricing, do you use it in Malta?
Well, ARP is what we have. It's what we have today. It's not what we should aim to keep. But if we remove it without an alternative, then it's a step backwards, not a step forward. So it's what we have. The perception that people tend to have as to how prices are negotiated, how eventual net prices are negotiated from the ARP down to the net price, is that the industry gets away with what it can. Basically, the price is set as what the industry thinks it can get away with, which is we're talking about people's lives here. I mean, it's really unfair to my mind. We really need to know that the price that we are paying is the price that is fair for everyone. And when the industry, as François did a few minutes ago, say we're not disclosing this for commercial reasons, people feel that for commercial reasons means that we're just going to get as much profit as we can out of you, which is not the way we should be. We should be doing medicine in Europe. So this is not just about the detail, which is extremely important, of which system we need to have, but it's principle. We need to agree on principle that we need a fair system for our citizens, and then fine. Let's talk about there's a pharmaceutical policy coming up now by the Commission, by the EU. Let's talk about the detail of how to do it, but we're not even agreeing on that we need to do it now. I absolutely feel that we need to come to this point. Price transparency is essential to make sure that we are all getting a fair deal, and that our patients have the best possible access to medicines that the country can afford.
Okay, thank you very much. I think interestingly also that you bring in this issue of trust as a third pillar, accountability towards the public, affordability, but also trust between stakeholders. And we come back to that in a minute. Also, thank you for mentioning the pharmaceutical strategy of the EU and this ongoing process of revising the general pharmaceutical legislation, which has, of course, implications for pharmaceutical policy in general. We come back to the issue in a minute in the second round. Erin, I think we come to you for a reflection on external reference pricing before going to Natasha, who I'm sure will have a couple of things to say about what we've heard so far. Erin, over to you.
Thanks, Demi. So I would say the external reference pricing was surprisingly present in all of our group interviews. Going into a discussion on net price transparency, there is always a question about what would the implications be if we continue to use external reference pricing. because there is indeed this fear of price convergence, so that certain countries may be left out if they're not able to pay for the higher price. But indeed, without a good alternative, I don't think that it's something that should be, gotten rid of overnight. So it needs to be considered in the context of many other pricing and pharmaceutical policies, and kind of how the effects of changing one would influence all of the other ones.
Thank you, Erin. And I think if I may build on this a second, our experience with the interviews for the brief reflects very well what we heard from all previous speakers, in the sense that for many countries, there really is no alternative. And if we only focus on those payers who have an extensive experience of negotiations and complicated systems, which might be in principle and in practice better alternatives, then we fail them basically. So we can't really talk about equitable access at that point. Natasha, I come to you for a brief statement because we have another round of discussion that I think will be quite interesting.
Thank you very much, Dimi, and congratulations to you and the team for putting this excellent brief together, which tackles a very complex subject, as has been highlighted by our spotlight speakers. A couple of points from my end, from the work that we have been doing, and there has been a request basically from practically all the countries across the European region, including the high-income countries, that the status quo is untenable. But from the work that we have commissioned, and we will be publishing a series of papers in the coming weeks, it's quite clear that the external reference pricing mechanism is not working to the satisfaction and needs of the system, that there are innovative payment models and pricing models that could be explored. What we are missing is an agreed framework to explore these models, to take them forward, to agree the metrics, to be able to evaluate ex ante whether these are actually successful or not. And this seems to be the natural next step. I think all stakeholders are agreeing that the current system is not working well for patients, is not working well to achieve the objectives. And external reference pricing is just one element of that.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I am still on. That all I think is really illuminating. All of you somehow already went into the territory of the next round of discussion, which really starts with perhaps with this question that Erica brought in about how big discounts actually are and who gets a better deal than someone else, and the need for transparency in this direction. So because we heard about this a little bit already, I'll modify the question a bit based on different things that you already talked about, most of you. And focus this on this notion of equity-based pricing that, François, you said you have a proposal for. It's available and participants can look at it. It's something that we also touch upon in the brief. This would, in my understanding and oversimplifying it, have basically a benchmark price, which is then varied based on countries' ability to pay. Is that a way that we can go? Is that something that would then mean that we don't need the discounts anymore? Is that applicable for all countries? And then I will ask the others if this is something that they see as desirable, or how we might move forward on something like that. And Natasha, I'm afraid I will give you the concluding role again, because I'm really interested to hear if in the discussions around Oslo, this is something that has been discussed, knowing from the background of the policy brief that previous discussions or attempts really didn't go very far because of different, or at least lacking, let's say, political support. So I would say this time we start with François, then we move to Sabine, and we move to Chris, and Erin and Natasha. You are our last two in this round as well. François, over to you. You have a new framework, and you have also your thoughts on this idea of perhaps some countries getting a worse deal right now, not based on ability to pay. Over to you for first reflections. Briefly, please, so that we can stick to time.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Dimitra. No, I just want to come back and just to say, worst deal that countries have is not getting access to innovative medicines. And basically, this should be the objective. And we have put forward a conceptual framework on equity-based tier pricing. It's a discussion document where we are making a number of commitments in terms of pricing of medicines, but we consider that those commitments will be contingent on the implementation of corresponding commitments from other parties necessary for this equity-based tier pricing framework to achieve the intended impact. And so basically, when we are speaking about equity-based tier pricing, we want to address this affordability element, which in some situations can impede access to patients in some countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Before going to Sabine, I will ask a slightly heretic question here. If we were to implement such a system, equity-based pricing with commitments on the side of the payers, would that then mean that we don't need discounts anymore, confidential discounts, because everyone knows what their price is and agrees that this is the price that they will pay?
In the conceptual framework that we are putting forward, it's clear that there are still the notion of confidentiality is inherent to the framework. So it's clear that there is some level of transparency, just because basically prices would in some way take into consideration the GNP per capita, but in some way there is still an element of confidentiality which is embodied in the conceptual framework. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it's interesting to look at it more closely and also discuss it.
The document is available on the EFPIA website, and I'm sure that there will be some discussions maybe in the context of the WHO Oslo Medicines initiatives around this concept of equity-based tier pricing. Thank you.
Thank you. Sabine, we come to you before we go to Deputy Prime Minister Fearne. Your thoughts on this?
Yes, with regard to the spread of the discounts, I simply do not know any researcher, no researcher knows it because it's transparent. I know a sole study by Dutch researchers, which then indicated that the large markets were those who got the high discounts and the smaller markets, no discounts or were not supplied the medicine. Smaller markets as well as countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think this is an indication. And with regard to the conceptual framework, if we talk about equity pricing, for me, this means absolutely that there's transparency. And this has also to do with the accountability principle, which we have been addressing now. The question is, who is in the driving seat? And for policymakers must be in the driving seat, but they must have also all the information needed to take good decisions, because otherwise it's again a splitting up and we may not move forward. So that's from my side.
Okay, thank you for that. Also very useful for discussions on such frameworks moving forward. Deputy Prime Minister Fearne, over to you. Your thoughts on equity-based pricing and deals, fair or otherwise?
Excuse me for being undiplomatic. I don't know how to be diplomatic, but I have to say this. François, speaking for EFPIA, said that the way they give discounts is by looking at the epidemiology or the economic reality on the ground of the countries that they are negotiating with. I'm sorry, that is just not true. One, we don't know for sure that this is happening because there is confidentiality. Two, from the little that we do know, and in the Valletta Declaration Group, there is some informal sharing of data. And as Sabine rightly said, it's exactly the opposite. What we are gleaning, and I say again, we don't know for sure because there's no countries are bound by confidentiality clauses that are imposed by the pharmaceutical industry, is the opposite of what EFPIA is saying, that the smaller countries end up paying through their teeth, which is extremely unfair. Going for a tiered or equity-based system, of course, it's fair. It doesn't need confidentiality. In fact, it thrives without confidentiality and needs transparency, but on its own is not enough. We actually need to know what the price, even the actual price is, even though countries who have smaller GDP might be paying less, but we need to know where those prices are coming from. So we need transparency along the whole chain, the research and development stage, in the clinical trial stage, in the marketing, in distribution. So we need to know, of course, we want a fair deal. We want the industry to have the financial incentives to create new drugs. It's fantastic that we have such a thriving industry in Europe, but we need to know that it's a fair deal. And this needs to be by collaboration. We want to collaborate with the industry. It shouldn't be by legislation. Yeah, the pharmaceutical strategy is coming up. There will be some forms of legislation there, but ideally we'd go for collaboration. It's of course beneficial for European citizens, but I make the point that it's also beneficial for the pharmaceutical industry, to jointly negotiate with the whole of Europe instead of with countless regional authorities is beneficial. Look what happened with vaccines for Pfizer, for Moderna, and look what's happening with the new drugs that are coming onto the market. The market is fragmented, and I submit that's not just bad for citizens, it's definitely bad for citizens, but it's also bad for the industry.
Thank you. I have the following problem. We have 3 minutes left, and I promised Natasha already 5 for her closing. And I think there is a lot of information that we still would like to talk about for a long time. So before I go to Erin and Natasha, I would suggest that then what Natasha does is actually close when it is your turn. So give us your reflection and your final statement. Unless there is something absolutely burning that one of you who is not Natasha, would like to share with us in 20 seconds. In that case, we can do that, but only that case. I would really hope that it's fine if we just move to Erin and then to Natasha for closing. And then hopefully we can arrange another webinar in due time to discuss the next steps a little bit more in depth. So I don't see anyone very obviously coming in. So Erin, I come to you, and then Natasha, over to you for closing. Erin.
I will keep it very short around
Yes.
equity pricing. I agree with Sabine that the payers can be in the driver's seat, but it is also important the governance above that, or the collaboration needs to be clearly defined in order for the to go on the right track. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Natasha, you're in the hot seat in a sense of wrapping up. Let me point out that the last points on equity-based pricing coming from anyone, and not only equity-based pricing, really very clearly showcase that effectively we're all on the same side when it comes to the ultimate goal, right? And the way to actually get there is through collaboration. And I think this is what you've been trying to do successfully, I would say, but with a lot of good effort in the past years, I would say a year and a half, maybe. So over to you for your experiences, Natasha, and for closing.
Thank you very much, Dimi. And basically for WHO, of course, transparency is one of the pillars. This all started with the transparency resolution. And when we were approached by the Norwegian government, one of the highest income countries in the region, to really try and do something as WHO on the novel high-priced medicines, one of the 3 pillars that we decided to focus on was transparency, with the other 2 being solidarity. And I heard a lot of talk of equity, and equity and solidarity are inextricably intertwined. And the final one, sustainability. And that is sustainability for health systems and sustainability, of course, for our industry. I think what is very clear is that there is a value and a principle in transparency, and this has been explained very well by previous speakers, but also that when we talk about transparency, we want to talk about transparency across the whole ecosystem, because there are levers for improvement across the whole ecosystem. I would like to acknowledge that the fact that we are seeing EFPIA coming forward with proposals is a recognition that the status quo is untenable, and that is already a much better starting point than we were in 2 years ago. However, we have spoken about the need for new payment models. We have spoken about the need for new and different mechanisms. And in order to be able even to move forward and to move forward in this collaborative spirit, we need to have the trust And I think the Oslo Medicines Initiative has been trying to build this dialogue and this trust. We need to have the tools, so we need to have the evidence on the tools. And the policy brief we are discussing today is just one of a series of tools and papers that are about to be launched in the coming weeks. And we also need to have the platform and the mechanism to allow us to take this forward, because we have to bear in mind that across the European region, we have very different capacities amongst our countries. It's not just the economy and the GDP, but it's also the capacities that we have. And of course, as WHO, this is ultimately the central tenet of our role, to support and build capacities. But it's in the sense also that bringing the health systems, the payers together as a counterpart to be able to dialogue with the multinational industry is, of course, very, very important also for ensuring that we have the capacity to deal with what is very new and very complex. Finally, I think we will land somewhere where it won't be a one-size-fits-all medicines approach, indeed not, and where we may need to explore different mechanisms to allow us to move forward depending on the types of medicines and products that we are going to be dealing with. Of course, we look forward to continue to serve as neutral brokers in this very hotly contested policy domain, where we ultimately all share the objective of ensuring that we can get better and faster access to effective medicines for all patients who need them, irrespective of where they live. Back to you, Dimi. I think we've gone a couple of minutes over, but not too bad.
Thank you very much, Natasha. All of those really important points, definitely worth the 3 minutes. And I think also very aptly catch the essence of what we've been talking about today. At this point, I would like to thank you all very, very much for your input and for your time. Also, a big thanks to our participants who have made very important points in the chat. We will save and share the chat with our panelists who are important decision makers in their areas, because there is quite a bit of really interesting things in there. Also, for example, that the issue of transparency is not just about pharmaceuticals, it applies to other technologies in the health system as well. And we need to look at that too. So also food for thought for us for new work. So thank you all very, very much, panelists and participants alike. And we look forward to seeing you soon at our next webinars. And we look forward to the next steps of the work under the Oslo Medicines Initiative and other platforms to make sure that we do achieve sustainable access to affordable medicines for everyone. Thank you very, very much and have a nice afternoon.